My dear friends, let us come together for a few moments in a spirit of quiet receptivity. Let us not come as seekers of more truth, or more understanding, or more spiritual experience, for seeking in itself implies that something is lacking. Rather, let us be still, and let this presence, which has never departed from us, reveal itself from within. The truth we are about to explore is not new, nor is it something to be attained. It is eternal truth that has forever been the foundation of your being, though perhaps not fully recognized. Every sincere student of the spiritual path begins with an earnest longing, the desire to know God, to feel God, to touch that infinite something which they know exists beyond the limitations of human sense. That longing is noble, and in its early stages it serves a purpose. It pulls us away from material dependency and lifts our gaze toward the invisible source. But there comes a time, inevitably, when that same longing becomes the very veil that prevents realization. For the moment I say, I must find God, I have affirmed, though unconsciously, that God is not here. I have affirmed separation, and the moment I affirm separation, I will continue to search for a lifetime without discovering that which has always been present. This is the great paradox on the spiritual path. We believe we are searching for God, but in the very act of searching, we make God into an object outside ourselves, a distant power that must be reached, attained, persuaded, or earned. And so we travel from teaching to teaching, from practice to practice, from book to book, with a subtle conviction that one more insight, one more meditation, one more mystical moment will finally bring us home. But, my friends, you cannot come home to what you never left. This is the great discovery that awaits every earnest student, that God is not the end of a journey, but the very ground upon which you have always stood, that the kingdom of God is not approached through effort, but revealed through recognition, that spiritual realization is not the result of acquiring truth, but of surrendering the belief that you do not already embody it. And it is this discovery we will enter into together today. Why truly awakened individuals eventually lay down the burden of seeking and rest in the presence that has forever been their own being. Not as theory, not as doctrine, but as living experience. Let us become still now, not to find anything, not to reach anything, but simply to acknowledge quietly, inwardly, that the very life within us is God, and that we stand not as seekers of truth, but as expressions of it. Now, let us look more deeply, my friends, at this impulse to search, this inner movement that compels so many earnest students to wander endlessly in the hope of finding God. We must understand the nature of this seeking mind, for until we do, we remain entangled in its subtle deceptions. The human mind is forever reaching, forever grasping, forever striving to complete itself. It hungers because it believes itself incomplete. It searches because it imagines something essential is missing. And whatever it touches, whatever it attains, becomes unsatisfying the moment it is possessed. This is not because you have failed. It is because the human mind cannot experience God. The finite cannot grasp the infinite. The temporal cannot contain the eternal. The mind which seeks is the very mind that stands outside of truth, and it will search from one lifetime to another without ever finding that which only Spirit can reveal. Every time you say, I must find God, you are speaking from the mind. Every time you say, I hope one day to awaken, you speak from the mind. Every time you imagine God in the distance or truth in the future, you speak from the mind. And the mind, by its very nature, can only project, anticipate, imagine, or remember, but it cannot behold reality. Reality must be revealed, and revelation comes only when the mind grows still. You see, the search itself is built upon a false assumption, the assumption that God is absent. The moment you assume absence, the search becomes endless. If you assume the treasure is far away, you will travel far but never arrive. If you assume the kingdom is hidden, you will look everywhere except where it is. And so the seeker, sincere and devoted though he may be, walks in circles around the very truth he longs to discover. Consider this. The fish searches for the ocean, not knowing it is already swimming in it. The wave searches for the sea, not knowing it is the sea. And the individual, imagining himself a separate self, searches for God, not knowing that the very life within him is God appearing as individual expression. As long as the fish seeks the ocean anywhere but here, it will remain restless. As long as you seek God anywhere but in the silent depth of your own being, you will feel unfulfilled. And so the spiritual journey becomes, for many, a kind of beautiful exhaustion, a cycle of effort, striving, discipline, and disappointment. Not because the seeker lacks sincerity, but because the seeker does not yet realize that the mind doing the seeking is the barrier to realization. The human mind cannot find God because God is not an object to locate. God is not a destination to reach. God is not a power to acquire. God is the very substance, the very essence, the very life of your being, already present, already complete, already whole. And the moment you cease seeking with the mind, you make room for the soul to recognize what has been true from the beginning. Let us sit together for a moment in that recognition, not seeking, not striving, but simply acknowledging. The presence I seek is the presence I am. Let us continue, my friends, by uncovering one of the most subtle and pervasive obstacles on the spiritual path, an obstacle unknown to those who merely dabble in spiritual ideas, yet encountered by all who sincerely desire to live in the awareness of God. It is the moment when the beautiful longing for truth transforms, almost without your noticing, into a perpetual state of seeking. And this seeking, innocent at first, becomes a kind of personal religion. There is a point in the journey when the student begins to identify as a seeker. He reads the books, attends the classes, meditates diligently, studies the scriptures, listens to the recordings, and discovers within himself a sense of purpose. I am one who seeks truth. And for a time, this identity feels noble, it feels spiritually elevated, it feels as though progress is being made simply by taking on the role. But let us look honestly and compassionately at what is taking place, because the moment I am a seeker becomes a part of one's self-image, a subtle ego arises, an ego more refined and more deceptive than the ordinary human ego. This spiritualized ego wears the garments of humility, but it lives on the same assumption of separation. I do not yet have. I do not yet know. I am not yet what I should be. And with this assumption, the seeking becomes endless. You see, the human mind delights in projects. It delights in striving. It delights in progress. And so it turns spirituality into a path of endless improvement, always moving toward God, never arriving. Always reaching for truth, never realizing truth. Always polishing the surface, never resting in the essence. This is the great trap. The seeker becomes attached not to finding, but to seeking. Seeking becomes comfortable. Seeking becomes familiar. Seeking becomes the identity you know how to live with. To let go of seeking feels like losing momentum, losing purpose, losing direction. And so the seeker clings to the search, not realizing the search is the barrier to finding. My friends, hear this gently. As long as you are the seeker, God remains the sought. For the seeker is a self-concept built upon lack, a sense of I am not yet, and the presence of God cannot be revealed to a consciousness that insists upon its own incompleteness. God is not found by one who seeks, but by one who stops insisting that something is missing. And so the spiritual path, when misunderstood, becomes a cycle of beautiful but fruitless effort, a lifelong preparation for a realization that could occur in this very moment if the seeking mind would only become still. Let us consider this carefully. Why does the seeker continue seeking? Because seeking provides a sense of spiritual activity. It creates the feeling of being on the path. It gives the mind something to do, to chase, to pursue. But spirit does not need activity. Spirit does not need chasing. Spirit reveals itself not to the seeker, but to the one who has laid down the role of seeker. When we stop searching for God as though God were absent, we make room for the realization that God has never been absent. The presence we seek is the life we are living, the breath we are breathing, the consciousness with which we are aware at this very instant. And so the spiritual trap becomes a stepping stone. For the moment we recognize it, we stop running in circles and become still. And in that stillness, the truth we have been seeking begins to reveal itself, not through effort, but through grace. Let us take a gentle pause now, not to seek, but to rest, to release the identity of the seeker and simply be the self that is whole, present, complete. Now, my friends, there comes a sacred moment on the path, a moment not created by human effort, not produced by intellectual understanding, and not manufactured by spiritual technique. It is a moment of pure grace, a moment in which the seeker, weary from striving and exhausted from searching, pauses long enough for truth to reveal itself, and in that pause, something remarkable, something utterly transformative, is quietly recognized. This recognition does not shout, it does not announce itself with fanfare, it does not arrive with emotional fireworks. It arises like a gentle dawn, so softly that one almost misses it. But in this stillness, in this quiet awareness, the soul perceives, perhaps for the first time, that what it has been seeking has always been present, that the God it sought in the distance has been the very life of its own being, that the truth it tried so desperately to attain was never absent, but simply unrecognized. This is the turning point. It is the moment when the seeker no longer says, I must find God, but rather, God is already here. It is the moment when one stops reaching toward heaven and begins to sense heaven within. It is the moment when the soul realizes that seeking can never lead to finding, because what is being sought is the very essence of the seeker. You see, spiritual awakening does not occur because one has accumulated enough knowledge or mastered enough practices. It occurs when the mind stops insisting upon its own separation. It occurs when we cease trying to become spiritual and accept that spirit is the reality of our being. It occurs when, for a brief and precious moment, we drop the belief that we must do something to reach God and simply rest in what already is. Let us understand this deeply. Awakening is not additive. It is revelatory. It does not bring something new into your experience. It unveils what has always been true. It does not transform you into something higher. It reveals that the higher self has always been your identity. It does not transport you to God. It reveals that you have never left God, nor could you ever do so. When this realization dawns, even faintly, something profound shifts within. The frantic searching begins to subside. The desire for spiritual achievement loses its grip. The compulsive need for answers relaxes. And in place of striving, there emerges a quiet certainty, a knowing without words, a peace without explanation, It is the peace of one who has stopped trying to find the ocean, having realized he is already immersed in it. And though this turning point may come gently, without drama, it marks the beginning of true spiritual life. For now, the individual is no longer driven by longing, but drawn by grace, no longer motivated by lack, but sustained by presence, no longer seeking God as an object, but resting in God as the substance of his own being. When this realization dawns, even faintly, something profound shifts within. The frantic searching begins to subside. The desire for spiritual achievement loses its grip. The compulsive need for answers relaxes. And in place of striving, there emerges a quiet certainty, a knowing without words, a peace without explanation. Let us sit together for a moment in the simplicity of this truth. I am not on the way to God. I am living in God as God's own expression. I always have been. Recognition is the cornerstone of spiritual living. Recognition is the essence of the Christ consciousness. Recognition is the foundation of every healing, every harmony, every demonstration of grace. And what do we recognize? Not something new, not something added, not something achieved. We recognize what is, what has always been, what cannot be changed by human belief or unbelief. Recognition is the awareness that the kingdom of God is already established, not in a far-off heaven, not in a future state of consciousness, but right here at this moment within the depths of your being. Seeking says, one day I will find. Recognition says, it is already present. Seeking says, if only I could reach God. Recognition says, I and the Father are one. Seeking says, I must improve, purify, elevate myself. Recognition says, the self that God formed is already whole. You see, once the mind ceases its restless searching, a new faculty begins to function, the faculty of spiritual awareness, the gentle intuition of the soul. In this awareness, you begin to perceive that truth does not come to you from the outside, nor does it arrive as the result of personal effort. Instead, it rises from within, like a quiet whisper saying, be still, for all is already fulfilled. This recognition transforms every aspect of life. When a problem appears, whether it concerns health, finances, relationships, or your own inner state, your first impulse is no longer to fix, to heal, to manifest, or to overcome. Instead, your first impulse becomes stillness, silence, a turning inward toward the presence already here. You no longer say, God, help me. You say, Father, I recognize your completeness in the midst of this appearance. You no longer plead for supply. You acknowledge that infinite supply already exists as the very substance of your being. You no longer strive to heal the body. You rest in the truth that divine life is already the reality of your body. And this recognition is not a technique. It is not a mental exercise or a spiritual formula. It is a state of consciousness, a realization of what is in spite of what appears. You are no longer trying to change the world. You are recognizing the spiritual truth behind it. And from this recognition, harmony unfolds naturally without strain. Let us understand, recognition does not create anything. It reveals the completeness that has always been present. It does not fix a broken world. It reveals that God's world was never broken. It does not strengthen you to overcome. It reveals that the divine self needs nothing added to it. Recognition is the shift from a life lived in pursuit of God to a life lived from God. It is the shift from striving to resting, from effort to grace, from human will to divine assurance. And so, my friends, let us pause here together, not to seek, not to imagine, not to repeat words, but simply to recognize. The kingdom is finished. The presence is here, and I abide in it now. Now, my friends, as this shift from seeking to recognition begins to take root, it expresses itself in your daily life in ways that are unmistakable, not because you force them, not because you discipline yourself into them, but because they arise naturally from a consciousness no longer driven by fear, desire, or spiritual ambition. These signs are not achievements. They are simply indications that your awareness is awakening to its true foundation in God. And as you observe them quietly within yourself, you will know that the old identity of the seeker is dissolving, and the reality of God consciousness is beginning to live your life. And so, my friends, let us pause here together, not to seek, not to imagine, not to repeat words, but simply to recognize. The kingdom is finished, the presence is here, and I abide in it now. Sign 1, prayer becomes communion, not petition. The first sign is this: your relationship to prayer undergoes a profound change. You no longer approach God as though God were outside of you, holding blessings that you must earn, request, or persuade. You no longer come to spiritual practice with an agenda: give me healing, fix this situation, bring harmony, remove fear. Instead, prayer becomes a resting, a communing, a beholding of the presence that has already completed all things. You begin to discover that true prayer is not asking, it is listening. Not reaching outward, but turning inward. Not striving to be heard, but yielding to the one who already knows. You enter prayer without words, without requests, without outlines, and in this sacred stillness, you feel the ineffable truth that God's grace is functioning even when the human mind sees no evidence. This, dear friends, is communion, silent, effortless communion in which the seeker disappears and only the presence remains. Sign 2, your first response to problems becomes silence, not panic. The second sign is equally revealing. When a challenge appears, a disturbance in the body, a financial uncertainty, a conflict in relationship, your first reaction is no longer fear, nor is it the urge to correct, to fix, or to solve. Instead, a natural pause arises, a quietness, a moment of inner listening. It is as though something within you says, "Be still. Let me show you the truth behind this appearance." You begin to recognize that the appearance is not the reality. The condition is not the truth. And so, rather than rushing to human solutions, you turn gently inward to the presence that is never disturbed. In this stillness, you acknowledge, in God's universe, nothing is lacking, nothing is broken, nothing needs repair. And from this recognition, the disturbance loses its authority. It may still require action, but the action arises from wisdom, not fear. It may still need attention, but the attention arises from peace, not urgency. It may still move through time, but time no longer holds the power to frighten you. This is the consciousness in which healing, supply, harmony, and guidance unfold, not because you force them to appear, but because you are no longer resisting the truth that they already exist. Sign 3, you feel guided rather than driven. The third sign is perhaps the sweetest of all. As your awareness rests more consistently in the spiritual fact of oneness, you find that life begins to unfold without strain, without pushing, without the endless effort to orchestrate outcomes. You feel guided not by voices, not by signs, not by dramatic revelations, but by a gentle, steady intuition that reveals the next step, the right action, the needed word. You no longer live from willpower. You no longer battle with decisions. You no longer demand clarity from circumstances. Instead, Clarity arises within you because the source of clarity is active as your consciousness. You act not because you must, but because the action flows naturally from the inner impulse of spirit. You speak not because you must convince or defend, but because words form out of the peace that fills you. You move through life with a sense of being carried, upheld, sustained. In this state, you do not feel alone because you are not alone. You are living from the one that lives you, and the burden of personal responsibility dissolves into the assurance of divine guidance. My friends, these three signs are not goals to strive for. They are simply the natural fruits of a consciousness that has stopped seeking and begun recognizing the presence already here. Observe them gently, without judgment, without comparison. Let them unfold in their own time as grace reveals itself through your inner awareness. Let us rest for a moment in this truth. The seeker has nothing more to find, for the self that God formed lacks nothing, and the presence that guides, sustains, and reveals is functioning as your very life now. Now, my friends, having seen the nature of seeking and the gentle signs that recognition is dawning, let us turn to what may be called the heart of this work, the practice that leads us not toward God, but into the quiet awareness that God is already here. Understand from the beginning that this practice is not a technique, not a method of the human mind, not a way to achieve a spiritual state. It is an entering into silence, an inner relaxation through which the presence makes itself known. You see, spiritual realization cannot be forced. It cannot be willed into being. It cannot be brought about by repetition or intensity. It comes only when we yield, when we release the activity of the personal self and create a space in which God may announce himself. The sanctuary of presence is not reached through effort. It opens in the moment we relinquish effort. Let us explore how this practice unfolds. The first movement, letting go of the desire to get something. All spiritual practice begins with a release not of the world, not of responsibility, but of the inner compulsion to acquire. The moment you enter meditation with the thought, I must find peace, or I must heal this condition, or I must feel God, you have already placed a barrier between yourself and realization. For such thoughts affirm lack. And so, the first step is the simplest and the most profound. Let go of every desire to receive. Lay down the burden of seeking. Allow yourself to rest without agenda. Say gently within yourself, I am not here to get anything. This single recognition quiets the seeking mind and opens the way for the soul's awareness. The second movement, acknowledging the presence already here. Once the desire to acquire has dissolved, we enter the second movement, a turning inward to acknowledge what is, not as a belief, not as an affirmation, but as a simple recognition. You may say, silently, God is here, or the presence is the life of my being, or simply rest in the knowing that the infinite is closer than breathing. This is not a declaration to create truth. It is a recognition of truth. And this gentle awareness begins to shift your consciousness from effort to grace. You do not try to feel God. You acknowledge God, and the feeling reveals itself when the mind is quiet. The third movement, entering the silence beyond words. As the recognition deepens, words become unnecessary. Thoughts subside, not through discipline, but through surrender. A natural stillness arises, and in that stillness you sense something subtle, a presence, an aliveness, a quiet fullness. This silence is not emptiness. It is fullness beyond sound. It is the inner sanctuary in which the personal self dissolves and the spiritual self stands revealed. You need not hold this silence. You need not protect it. You simply rest in it, gently, without effort. This is the beginning of true meditation, not the mind speaking, but the soul being. The fourth movement, allowing the presence to reveal itself. In this sacred stillness, something beautiful occurs. You realize that you are not the one doing the meditating. You are being lived. You are being breathed. You are being held by a presence that does not originate in your effort. The spiritual activity is no longer yours, it is God's. You become aware that the guidance you sought, the peace you desired, the healing you hoped for, are not things to be achieved, but expressions of a presence that is functioning as your very life. You do not reach for it. You simply allow it. This is the sanctuary of recognition. This is the place where seeking ends. This is the atmosphere in which grace unfolds. The fifth movement, returning to the world without losing the center. Eventually, you will open your eyes, rise from your chair, and resume the activities of daily life. But something has changed. You now carry within you a sense of inner spaciousness, a quiet awareness of the presence that never left you. You move through your tasks gently, without hurry. You speak with a softness that was not there before. You act, but the action arises from stillness, not compulsion. This, my friends, is living from the sanctuary. You do not withdraw from the world. You do not escape responsibilities. You simply perform them from a place of inner sufficiency, knowing that you are not the thinker, not the doer, but the instrument through which God expresses. And as this becomes natural, the practice is no longer something you do. It becomes a state of consciousness, a way of being, a living awareness of the presence that sustains and guides all things. Let us rest now quietly in that sanctuary where nothing is missing, nothing is lacking, nothing is sought, and all is already fulfilled in God. Now, my friends, let us turn to what may be the most beautiful and liberating part of the spiritual journey, the life that unfolds after the search has come to its natural end. This does not mean that you become passive or indifferent. It does not mean that you withdraw from the world or cease to care about the circumstances of your life. On the contrary, life becomes fuller, richer, more joyful, more harmonious, because it is no longer lived through the strain of a personal self trying to survive, improve, achieve, or understand. Life becomes the effortless expression of the presence that lives you. Let us look gently at what begins to change, living without the burden of becoming. When the search ends, the burden of becoming, of trying to be more spiritual, more enlightened, more worthy, drops away. You realize that the you who was trying to improve was never the real self at all. And in that moment, you feel a profound relief, as though you have laid down a weight you carried for decades without noticing. You no longer live with the pressure to attain a future spiritual state. You no longer measure your progress. You no longer judge your experiences as success or failure. You simply are, and in that simple being, something miraculous occurs. The true self, the God self, shines through without obstruction, a new relationship with problems and challenges. Problems do not disappear simply because the search has ended. Bills still arrive. The body still requires care. People still express human emotions. The world still moves according to its own rhythm. But your relationship to all of this is entirely different. When a challenge arises, you no longer feel threatened. You no longer feel as though life is happening to you. Instead, You meet every appearance with quiet assurance, knowing that behind the form is an invisible reality, untouched by the condition. You understand that appearances have no power of their own. You understand that discord is never a statement about God. You understand that harmony is not created, it is revealed. And so you move through difficulties with a serenity that surprises even you, not because you have developed stronger willpower, but because you are not facing life alone. You are resting in the one that lives your life. Relationships become expressions of love, not exchanges of need. As the search ends, a profound shift occurs in your relationships. You no longer approach others seeking love, approval, validation, or security. You no longer require others to fill the sense of lack you once believed you carried. Instead, you begin to see each person as an expression of the same divine life that animates you. You meet them in the awareness of wholeness, not incompleteness. In this consciousness, relationships become harmonious not by effort, but by recognition. Conversations soften, conflicts dissolve, understanding grows. Love flows naturally, not as sentiment, but as the quiet recognition of oneness. You find yourself giving without depletion, listening without defensiveness, and responding without fear. This is not because you try to be loving, but because love is the nature of the presence that now governs your being. The dissolving of fear, my friends, is the child of separation. It arises only in the belief that you stand apart from the source of life. But when the search ends and oneness becomes a living awareness, fear begins to lose its authority. You do not become reckless. You simply become peaceful. You do not become careless. You become inwardly anchored. Fear may still knock at the door, but it no longer finds a home. It has no foothold in a consciousness that knows God as its own being. And so you discover a quiet courage, not born of effort, but born of recognition. Where I am, God is, and that is enough. Daily living becomes simpler, lighter, more radiant. You do not become reckless. You simply become peaceful. You do not become careless. You become inwardly anchored. Fear, my friends, is the child of separation. It arises only in the belief that you stand apart from the source of life. But when the search ends and oneness becomes a living awareness, fear begins to lose its authority. Not because you force these qualities into being, but because your consciousness is no longer obstructed by fear, striving, or self-judgment. You have made room for God to live through you. Your spiritual practice becomes a way of being, not a ritual. As the search dissolves, spiritual practice becomes natural and uncontrived. Silence becomes your refuge, not because you must meditate, but because awareness returns home to itself effortlessly. Prayer becomes a continual recognition of presence, not a request for intervention. Study becomes inspiration, not obligation. You begin to understand what Paul meant when he said pray without ceasing. It does not mean constant words. It means constant awareness, a quiet, living companionship with the presence that has never once left you. The realization that you are being lived, not because you force these qualities into being, but because your consciousness is no longer obstructed by fear, striving, or self-judgment. You have made room for God to live through you. This realization removes the last traces of fear, the last remnants of struggle, the last illusions of separation. You become a transparency for God, an instrument through which the infinite plays its own melody. And in this awareness, life is not merely lived, it is revealed. Let us rest for a moment in this gentle truth. Life after the search ends is not the end of spiritual growth. It is the beginning of spiritual living. It is the life God has always been living through you. And now, my friends, we come to the closing of our time together. Not an ending, but a gentle invitation into a deeper beginning for all that we have explored today, all that has stirred within you, all that has been recognized, points to one simple and eternal truth. There is nothing to seek and nothing to become. All is already fulfilled in God. This is the great surrender, not the surrender of effort alone, not the surrender of desire alone, but the surrender of the belief in incompleteness. To surrender is not to give up, it is to give over. It is to release the identity of the seeker and to rest in the identity of the one who has never been separated from its source. Let us gently review this truth, not with the mind that analyzes, but with the heart that knows. God is not a goal to reach. God is not a destination somewhere beyond the horizon of your efforts. God is the life you are living, the breath you are breathing, the consciousness with which you hear these words. There is no distance. There is no delay. There is no process of becoming divine. You are the expression of the divine now. And so we arrive at the essence of this path. Stop seeking, not because you should, but because what you seek is already yours. Not because you are tired, but because God has already answered before you asked. Not because you have failed, but because you could never lose what is eternally one with you. The great surrender is the willingness to rest in what is, not in what might be, not in what you hope will be, but in the living truth of this moment. For in this moment, the presence is complete. In this moment, grace is active. In this moment, the kingdom is finished. If you can accept this, even faintly, even for an instant, you will know the peace that passes understanding, a peace that does not depend on circumstances, a peace that arises from the recognition of your true identity as God's own expression. So let us sit quietly together now in these final moments and allow this truth to settle deeply. I am not the seeker. I am not the struggler. I am not the one trying to reach God. I am the expression of God's own life. And in this realization, all is already fulfilled. Let this awareness be your companion as you leave this room or this recording. Let it guide your thoughts, your actions, your conversations. Let it become the silent background of your day, the inner music of your being. For the more you rest in what already is, the more life reveals itself as harmony, as provision, as love, as the effortless activity of God made visible as you. And so, my friends, we close with the simple but eternal truth. It is finished, not as a promise of what will be, but as the reality of what always has been. Rest in it, live in it, be it, for this is the life that God is living as you.